One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
The next piece in our finding your personal food code and trying to set the combination to unlock all the benefits of eating properly and for your body and your physiology is once we set our calories and set our protein levels, is to hit what I call the carbohydrate sweet spot. Now, in like these days in the world of nutrition and particularly as it relates to carbohydrate intake, you kind of have two camps. You have the high carb people that are promoting the intake of not unhealthy sources in terms of sugary foods and drinks, but high carbohydrates, including lots of whole grains typically and starchy vegetables, that kind of stuff. And this is kind of like classic old school nutrition dietetics advice. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have low carb, ketogenic, and even all the way to zero carb in the world of full-blown carnivore. And the reality is you'll see healthy people among both ends of the spectrum, as well as places in between. You might argue that in general, the lower carbohydrate crowd tends to win out overall, but I'll leave that for other people to argue about because it's not really something that I feel like I need to get into. What I will tell you is that I'll give you the benefit of my 20 plus years, 25 plus years of working in natural medicine in the last 14 or so, teaching functional medicine seminars to doctors literally from around the world, all throughout the country in the United States. And that is not do I only get to observe my own clinical practice and the people that I've worked with over 2 decades or more. I get to talk to other doctors that are doing things in their practice based on their education, their experience, and their observations. And so we kind of get this great collective viewpoint. And I would say that as a general rule, most clinicians that are up to speed on modern research as it relates to nutrition, food, dietetics, and the control of things like blood sugar and insulin levels, is that while some people might benefit from going to the more extreme levels of being ketogenic or carnivore. And I don't mean extreme in the sense that those are negative. I'm just saying along a spectrum, it's to the far end of one of the spectrums because I do believe that there's great benefit for some people in those things. But when you start to look at the spectrum and where health starts to become optimized, one of the first things that becomes very obvious is that for most people, we have to limit carbohydrate intake. Not even talking about the quality of the carbohydrates yet, but we have to limit carbohydrate intake to the lowest level that someone can consume and still maintain function. For some people, we have to get below a certain point of carbohydrate intake before things start to get better. And as we continue to stair step down their carbohydrates to lower levels, they get increasing function. So carbs go down, function and improvements go up. But then sometimes there can come a point where we drop carbohydrates down too low and then they start to lose ground. They in other words, they destabilize. And that usually comes in the form of having low blood sugar type symptomatology, like being, anxious, shaky, irritable, brain foggy, mood swings, and all this kind of stuff. And so what we find in those cases that it's very beneficial to get to the point where someone destabilizes and then add back a certain amount of carbohydrates that brings back their brain function, their energy, stabilizes any anxiety they might be having, eliminates craving, hunger, and improves their sleep patterns. And you should recognize that as the Beach's check monitoring system that I suggested when we talked about calorie sufficiency beforehand. That also applies to carbohydrate sufficiency. And I'm not really tied to a number, but if you look at standard American diet, most Americans are eating somewhere around the realm of 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. And so anything, let's say 150, 125 or below is considered low carbohydrate. even though someone who's on an ultra low carb diet eating 30 to 50 grams of carbs per day might look at 125 as being quite a lot. It's certainly not when you compare to what the average American is. And if you're not familiar with grams of carbohydrates, and if I say, someone's eating 30 grams a day, well, guess what? That's an apple in a salad. Or it's a little more than, maybe a third of a cup of rice if you're okay with eating rice and you tolerate that. So that's not all that much. So what I found, and this is through, again, my own observation, but then confirming it with other people that I interact with as colleagues and sometimes as people that I coach and mentor, is that somewhere between 75 grams and 125 grams of carbohydrates per day is where most people are going to start to feel really good. The brain is clear, the energy is consistent and stable, their mood is stabilized, they're not craving, they're not hungry, and their sleep patterns start to smooth out. That doesn't mean that there's not more benefit to going even lower. Somebody might do better at 75 grams of carbs per day versus 100 grams. They might do better at 50 compared to 90. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. There's some room for experimentation, if you will. But the whole point is this, is that the vast majority of people, particularly those eating a standard American diet, are eating too many carbohydrates, and it's altering their caloric state. It's altering blood sugar control, particularly as it relates to insulin sensitivity. And there are all negative consequences associated with that. So most people can benefit from shifting their caloric intake, downgrading or de-emphasizing the carbohydrates, and making sure the carbohydrates they do eat are high quality ones, as opposed to in conjunction with increasing the intake of calories from healthy fats. And this is why I was saying before, I think it was in the last episode, that it's maybe helpful to think of all these different parameters or variables or digits in the combination. If you want a mental picture, think of a seesaw or a teeter-totter, where you have a plank across the board that tilts up and down because there's a fulcrum that sits right in the middle. That fulcrum is how many calories and how much protein you're eating. Those are kind of fixed and stable. But what is variable is, are you eating more fat and less carbohydrate, or are you eating more carbohydrate and less fat? And what is the impact of that choice on your functionality, your symptom control, as well as your ability to maintain balance and control over long periods of time? So the first thing that I typically do with people when we're working on finding their ideal diet, set calories, set their protein intake, and then the first thing we do is, okay, let's limit our carbohydrates to between 125 and 70. Let's start at 125, and we'll see how you do for a couple of weeks. And if we feel you're okay, let's go from 125 to 100 for a couple of weeks. Let's see how you do. And if you're okay, let's go to 75. And then somewhere along the way, we either choose to keep going down because we see more benefit in doing so, or we add back some carbs because going down too low causes that destabilization and really brings in some low blood sugar symptomatology. And then it's up to us at that point as to whether or not we actually stay within that parameter, whether or not we stay within that parameter, or whether or not we try to fix something to allow their carbohydrate intake to go even lower. The goal is not necessarily to come across and say ultra low carb diets or ketogenic diets are the best for everybody. I think it's probably something that's worth exploring, and certainly a ketogenic diet and the benefits that come from that can be done periodically and intermittently rather than being your general lifestyle. There's a lot of people feel really good on a ketogenic or very low carbohydrate diet, but they don't find it sustainable for some reason. Others do. And so what we might do is take, okay, out of the run of the year, every quarter, you're going to spend 2 weeks in keto. And then you're going to cycle in and out of that, but you're still going to be controlling your carbohydrate intake throughout that entire process. Now, one thing before I finish out this one is, talking about filling in with healthy fats, because I want to talk, at some point, I do want to talk about quality, and we'll have to apply that to protein, fat, as well as carbohydrates. So let's just keep this conversation to how much protein, how much carbohydrates, and then how much fats. If you are setting your calorie goal first, and then you're taking away some calories from that total based on how much protein you're going to take in, and then the first thing you do to decide between carbohydrates and fats is to limit your carbohydrates. Let's say you start at 125. Well, you know, or should know at this point, that each gram of carbohydrates gives you 4 calories. So if I'm eating 125 grams of carbs, that's 1,000 calories. So I subtract that from my total. And then the total number of calories that are left over after I take out calories for protein, also 4 grams per calorie. Take out calories for carbohydrates, 4 grams per calorie. My caloric allotment then for the rest of the day is made up of fat. Now that carries a calorie value of 9 calories per gram of fat, but now I start to choose healthy choices. So whether my fats are coming from things like olive oil or coconut oil or ghee or even going back old school, like butter if you can handle dairy, and even cooking with things like lard or duck fat or bacon grease. These are actually, don't worry about the whole saturated fat thing. That'll be a whole other segment in the Inflammation Nation podcast. But making sure, let's throw avocado in there if I didn't say it. Let's make sure that when you're choosing to fill up your calories with healthy fats or with fats, that you're making healthy choices. So let me say it one more time in terms of how we construct or deconstruct your macronutrient profile. You start with the total number of calories that you're going to eat in the run of a day, and you're going to track that for a couple of weeks and then make adjustments after 2 weeks based on how your body's responding to how you set that parameter. Then on a daily basis with respect to your macronutrients, you take protein and you set that, I'm going to suggest at, unless you're lifting weights and have a lot more muscle, I'm going to say you suggest that at 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you're going to eat 200 times 0.7. That's 140 grams of protein. We know that each gram of protein contains 4 calories. That's 140 times 4. That's 560 calories coming out of your total caloric pool just from protein. Next, we set our carbohydrates. Let's say we set it at 125 grams. That is 500 calories coming out for carbohydrates. So we have 560 from protein, 500 from our carbohydrates. That's 1,060. Just call it 1,000 just to make the math really super simple. And if I'm eating only 1,500 calories per day, let's call it 1,600. And I'm just picking a number just again to make math relatively easy, then my 1,600 total minus 1,000 coming from protein and carbohydrates means that I have 600 calories left over that I have to get from fat. Each gram of fat contains 9 calories. Let's call it 10 to make it, it's not 10, but let's call it 10 just to make the math easy. I have to eat about 60 grams of fat during the day to make the math all work out. So it's really kind of a mathematical trickle-down effect. Set your calories first, take out the appropriate amount of protein, take out an appropriate amount of carbohydrates, and what's left over with your total calories, you divvy that up among your healthy fat sources. So that's how we start to dial in, if you will, the part of our combination code that relates to how much, not how much do you eat, but what we eat, but also folding in a quantity portion. Now, in the next episode, we're going to flip the switch just a little bit, and we'll talk about content. This is still in terms of what you eat. So there's 3 aspects of what you eat. There's the macronutrient profile that we just went through. There's the content, which that it relates to the content of the entire diet piece rather than macronutrients. And then beyond that, we have to get into discussion about quality, and we'll end up talking about quality of protein, quality of fats, and then quality of carbohydrates. It's a ton of stuff, which is why we break this up into smaller episodes. And I really, truly hope that you're enjoying the content that we deliver here at the Inflammation Nation. Stay tuned. Next episode's coming up. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com. to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.